Why are we here? What are we doing here? I'm sure people asked you, as you said you were going on this trip, why are you going? What are you doing? And they asked it from all different perspectives and in all different kinds of ways. There's an eternity to the Jewish people that will last forever and ever. No matter how many times we go down, we will always come back up. That's the promise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And through this trip, we will experience a lot of the highs of Jewish history. We're experiencing a lot of the lows of Jewish history, but the message today and every day of the trip and at the end of our trip is that we are here, we survive, our people survives for all eternity. That's the promise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As we learn and we absorb, each one of us, whether you know it or not, whether you think it or not, will be changed by what we learn and by what we see. And that's also our responsibility, to be changed, to be shaken by the trip, to be shaped by the trip, to incorporate what we learn and what we see into the way that we live our lives going forward. And it's important to reflect upon that as we go through the stages of the trip.
Most of our time here this morning is not going to be about the ghetto, is not going to be about the Shoah. That our job here is not only to learn about the destruction of Polish Jewry, but it is to learn about the life, the vibrancy of the more than 900 Polish Jewish communities that existed for almost 1,000 years before the Shoah. We should not wipe that off in one fell swoop, as the Nazis tried to do. First of all, let's look at the graphics. Okay, what can we say about this person? He's a Kohen, and by the way, that's probably why he's here at the very beginning of the cemetery, so family members who are Kohanim would be able to come close to the grave, hear a hesped, hear the askara year after year, etc. You also can see to the right of the hands, you see books. Okay? So this person was a person of learning. Well, what are some of the contrasts between these two matzevot?
Oh, but then they do say it in Hebrew, though.
So wait a minute. So first of all, this has no secular language. Mm-hmm. That says something about this person or this person's family, whoever put up the matzevah. Only in Hebrew, no other language. Here we have two languages. Mm-hmm. We have Polish and we have Hebrew here at the bottom. For those who are far and can't see, there's Hebrew at the bottom. Now that's also significant, because not only are there two languages, but the first language, the one that most people will see, is Polish. That says something about this family in 1919, this person or this family, that Polish was their first language. And yet, the Hebrew was still important enough to them that they included it. We'll see other matzevot where there's only Polish. And what can we see from the graphics? She was a Ba'alat Tzedakah. Anything else? She was educated. She was educated. Take a look at the books. Okay, so she's a woman of learning. She's a Ba'alat Tzedakah. What's the curtain doing there? The tzedakah that she gave was mostly anonymous. The curtain is there to tell us that she gave it b'seiter. Matan b'seiter yichapeh af. If you give anonymously, it will remove God's anger. It'll cover God's anger. Okay? Giving tzedakah anonymously, the Rambam writes, is an extremely high madrega, an extremely high level. This is a section of Bundists. The Bund, a Jewish socialist party, Yiddishists, very ardent secularists, anti-religious, anti-Zionists. They wanted to bring about the socialist revolution here in Poland, and they believed that once that would happen, Jews would have cultural autonomy and anti-Semitism would disappear. They were an enormous movement here in Poland. They were the largest socialist party in Poland. There were even religious people who voted for the Bund. Particularly if you were a religious person who worked in a factory and you appreciated the fact that the Bundists were fighting for higher wages and better working conditions for you. Here you could see a memorial to the ghetto fighters who were Bundists. You could see that he's holding a gun, he's holding a hand grenade, and you'll notice it's a little bit hard to see in the sunlight. You'll see everything is in Polish and Yiddish. There's not a word of Hebrew. Hebrew for the Bundists was not the language of choice because it was either connected to religion or connected to the Zionists. And they didn't want any part of either of those. This is actually not a grave, but rather a monument, a symbolic grave to a man by the name of Janusz Korczak. But actually, that wasn't his name. His real name was Henryk Goldschmidt, or Hirsch Goldschmidt. He was born in 1878. He trained as a doctor. He came from an assimilated Jewish family. He establishes an orphanage for Jewish children here in Warsaw. It's so successful that there's a demand for him to establish a Catholic orphanage as well, and he does that too. And he has very progressive ideas for his time about education, child rearing, parenting. He becomes very well known and becomes a radio star in the interwar years in Poland with a radio show about how to raise children. He adopts a very Polish sounding name for his radio show. He was concerned that if he had a name like Henryk or Hirsch Goldschmidt, that some people would not be interested in hearing what we'd have to say. So he takes a name that sounds like a Polish nobleman, Janusz Korczak, and that's how the world knows him until today.
In 6th grade, I think we had a project to do. You had to pick a Jewish hero and do research and present it. And I picked Janusz Korczak, and ever since then I've always felt very connected to him and his story. And I think what always struck me, from the moment of pre-war to the ghetto, to the Umschlagplatz, to Treblinka, what he was able to do was create life in the midst of death. And that is truly a phenomenal experience to be able to see that from the outside. And not to take anything away from Janusz Korczak, but I think what we'll start to hear as David continues the day is that that was not an uncommon story. It's something for us that seems absolutely incredible and unfathomable. How do you create life in the midst of death? But that's the story of all these great heroes that we're going to talk about, and simple people we're going to talk about. But he was certainly a leader and a person who really was able to create that in the most phenomenal way.
Today, there are schools named for him here in Poland. There are streets named for him here in Poland. Janusz Korczak was offered by non-Jewish friends the ability to escape and not to have to go into the ghetto. People offered to hide him. Korczak said, "I'm going with my orphans into the ghetto." And so the Jewish orphanage was moved into the Warsaw ghetto. And he was tireless in his efforts to try to get enough food to be able to feed the orphans. But when the great deportations began from the ghetto in the summer of 1942, Korczak and his orphans were taken to the Umschlagplatz, the gathering place before the Jews were loaded onto the trains. And this artistic rendition is meant to show that march from the orphanage to the Umschlagplatz. Esther Rachel Kaminska and her husband were founders of a Yiddish theater troupe that not only performed here in Poland, but performed all over Europe and even went to the United States. They were the most important Yiddish theater troupe in the interwar years. And just so that we have a sense of how big Yiddish theater was, in 1937, in Warsaw alone, 500,000 people saw the Yiddish theater. The Yiddish theater blossomed in the interwar years, along with a nascent Yiddish film industry. Yiddish films were being produced here in Poland in the 20s and 30s, the most famous of which is the Dybbuk. Praise of God in his throat and a double-edged sword in his hand, because he's a mohel, right? And maybe he was a chazan as well. We're missing much of what's written here, but there's enough here for us to make sense of it. Mohel harashi b'medinatenu kishishim shana. He was the chief mohel in our country for about 60 years. Moreinu harav Reb Yaakov Tzvi, ben Moreinu Rav Reb Yehuda Azal. So his name was Yaakov Tzvi Vittelzim. Hanikra, but his nickname was Reb Couple Moel. That's what everybody called him. That's why it says here of Couple Moel on the top. There is a little stool here. Kisei Shel Eliyahu.
Standing here in the OL of the Netziv Volozhin and Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, which we're going to talk about in a second. But before we do that, standing in a cemetery, as the saying goes, that the happiest places we're going to visit in Poland are the cemeteries. And that's because people are remembered, people have a gravestone. The question is what we're doing in a cemetery. Why do you come to a cemetery? Why do we visit graves at all? So part of the reason we do is to pay respects to people and to be able to remember them. But part of that, the reason why we go, I think, is to be able to be inspired ourselves by their memory and what they did. And standing in this cemetery in Poland, in Warsaw, I feel not only it's the happiest place, but one of the most fascinating places. As we've been seeing, the mosaic of Jewish life in Warsaw really comes to life when you see this cemetery, but also one of the most sobering experiences. You stand here at graves of people who accomplished more in their lifetime than we can ever imagine. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, what are we taking away? What are we living for? What are our values? What do we want to accomplish in the short time? Life is limited, and we see that by the names and the dates on many of these tombstones. What do we want to accomplish in our own life? We stand here at the kever of two incredible giants of Torah who literally shaped the world of Torah that we live in. But aside from that, they had laser-sharp focus on exactly what they wanted to accomplish in life. And because of that, they accomplished so much, something that we need to learn from them.
He died in 1917. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. There are streets named after him here in Warsaw, as well as in Yerushalayim, and I think Tel Aviv as well, and maybe in other places. There's also a street named Esperanto here in Warsaw. And Esperanto was a language that he designed that would unify the world. His dream was to create world peace, because after all, if national languages were tied to 19th and early 20th century nationalism, if everybody would speak one language, then there would be no more cause for war, right? Sort of like John Lennon's Imagine. But his dream was world peace, and this was the way he thought he would accomplish it. And they used to get together, Esperanto speakers, right? Idealists from all over the world, and they used to have conferences where they would come together. They would only speak Esperanto one to another, except they said during the lunch breaks. And during the lunch breaks, people would revert to their native tongue, which usually was Yiddish. Because so many of the Esperanto speakers were actually Jews. The ghetto was formed in Warsaw in November 1940, which, by the way, Warsaw was not the first ghetto. 1940, November, it's more than a year after the Nazi occupation. And when the ghetto is formed, the first people to die in the ghetto are given regular Jewish burials, buried here in the cemetery in their own plot. But as the mortality rate soars, and as 5 and even 10,000 people a month die inside the ghetto, people are buried in mass graves. There are a few exceptions. Adam Chernyakov was the head of the Jewish Council in the Warsaw Ghetto, the head of the Judenrat in the Warsaw Ghetto. The Nazis established a Jewish council in every Jewish community. A Jewish council, a Judenrat, that would be answerable to them and was responsible to put all of their decrees, to implement all of their decrees. Adam Chernyakov becomes the head of the Judenrat. We have his diary, and I'll explain later why we have his diary. And you can see from his diary, and we know that he and other Judenrat leaders in other places often set up public health facilities, public soup kitchens, to try to help the impossible conditions of the ghetto, to help people survive. On the other hand, he was answerable to the Nazis. It was what one historian calls choiceless choices. It was a terrible situation to be in. In the case of Chernyakov, there were many Jews in the ghetto who hated him, who blamed him for many of their troubles. When Chernyakov is told by the Nazis in July, 76 years ago this month, the Nazis tell Chernyakov 5,000 Jews have to appear at the Umschlagplatz. And Chernyakov understood from that they were going to be deported. And he, who had consistently told the younger members of the Warsaw Jewish community, the Nazis are not going to kill us. We just have to überleben. We just have to survive. We have to outlive them. When he hears this order, he understands he's been duped. He understands because they tell him not only 5,000 today, but every day now for the next 60 days. 5,000 Jews have to appear at the Umschlagplatz for resettlement in the East, as they called it, which really meant deportation to a death camp, Treblinka, for most of them. Chernyakov, instead of following the order, swallows poison and commits suicide. Chernyakov is one model. We mentioned Lodz, the second largest city in Poland, the second largest ghetto. 160,000 Jews in the Lodz ghetto under the leadership of Chaim David Rumkowski. Chaim David Rumkowski was a different model of a Judenrat leader. He was a megalomaniac. He put his own portrait on the ghetto currency. He rode in a horse and carriage. He molested women. Chaim David Rumkowski was a very hated figure. So much so that there's even a report, probably not true, that when the last deportations from Lodz to Auschwitz took place and he was on the train, the Lodz Jews murdered him on the train and he never even made it to Auschwitz. Probably not true, but that's how much he was hated. When the Nazis ordered him to have Jews go to the train station to be deported, he urged the Jews to cooperate. He said, give me your children under the age of 10. Give me your elderly over the age of 60. Those are the ones who can work the least. The speech that he gave is in Yad Vashem, in the Historical Museum, and he says, sometimes you have to cut off a limb to save the body. If the Jews of Lodz didn't hate him before, they hated him even more after that speech, because certainly they were not going to turn over their children. They were not going to turn over their parents. And there were Jew hunts in the Lodz ghetto by the Jewish ghetto police and by the Germans to round people up because people didn't show up and they didn't hand over their children and their parents. The first great academic work on the Shoah as a whole comes out in 1961, written by Raoul Hilberg, professor at Dartmouth, called The Destruction of the European Jews. It's still a classic. And in it, Raoul Hilberg identifies 4 stages in the destruction of Polish Jewry. And I remind you, 3 million Polish Jews were killed, about half of the total of the victims in the Shoah. 4 stages. The first stage, he says, is concentration. What is concentration? Concentration means that Jews from smaller communities are brought into larger communities, forcibly. They're refugees. They have no place to stay. The lucky ones have relatives or close friends, and they crash there. But otherwise, the Warsaw Jewish community itself under siege now has to deal with all of these refugees. If there were 380,000 Jews in Warsaw in 1939 before the German invasion, the Jewish population of Warsaw is going to swell to about 450,000 now. Almost 500,000 people. And then comes the next stage of concentration, which is taking all of those Jews from wherever they live in the city and moving them to one neighborhood, the Jewish residential quarter, as the Germans called it, the Warsaw Ghetto, as we call it. The Nazis purposely made it terribly overcrowded. When they drew the map of the ghetto, they cut away all the parks. The overcrowding in the ghetto is one of the singular features of ghetto life. In fact, when the Nazis will start to deport the Jews, they will shrink the borders of the ghetto in order to keep it overcrowded. What is the overcrowding like? The sources we have say that it was an average of 6 or 7 people to a room. What does that mean? Let's imagine that a typical apartment in Warsaw would have had 2 or 3 bedrooms, a living room, 1 bathroom. That was for a family. A kitchen. In fact, many of us are familiar with the idea that probably many of the apartments didn't even have a bathroom in the apartment, but had one down the hall that everybody on the floor shared. But let's assume this is a more well-to-do apartment. Now imagine that instead of one family sharing that space, you have one family per room. Mother, father, children, perhaps an elderly grandparent, all living in the one room. In the same apartment, you have 3 or 4 other families, each one in a room. Everybody's sharing that one bathroom. Everybody's sharing that one kitchen. Basically, it means in that one room, you have mattresses wall to wall. What does it mean for hygiene? What does it mean for modesty? How do you get dressed and undressed? Privacy. The second stage he calls confiscation. Confiscation meaning Jewish property, Jewish businesses, real estate, bank accounts, radios, cars. In the winter of 1941, furs are confiscated. You understand that in the Warsaw Ghetto, it was almost impossible to heat a home. Where were you going to get coal, which was what was used to heat homes in Poland in those days? Where were you going to get coal in the ghetto? You could get it smuggled in. But in the ghetto, they wrote about coal, they called it black pearls. That's how expensive it was. And if you could get your hands on a little bit of coal, what would you use it for first? Would you use it to heat the house? Would you use it to cook? So first stage, concentration. Second stage, confiscation. Third stage is what he calls weakening, the physical weakening of the Jews. The Nazis provided very little food for the ghetto, not nearly enough. The estimates are that 80% of the food in the ghetto was smuggled in. There were 2 kinds of smuggling. One was big-time operations that were done by criminal elements in the Jewish community who had contacts with criminal elements outside of the ghetto. And they would bring in tremendous quantities of food. And they made a fortune. A fortune. So that in the ghetto, you have people who are starving, you have people who are near starving, and then you also have a small number of people who are literally eating caviar in the Warsaw ghetto. Those are the big time smugglers. But there was another kind of smuggling that took place, and that was the smuggling of an individual for his or her family. And this was often done by children. Why children? People are more likely to have pity on a child. That child who's going out to get bread for his family, he has no money. He's begging. There's one survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto who writes that he was a child in the ghetto and he went out to get food for his family. And where does he go? He went back to his old apartment building outside of the ghetto. He knocked on the door of neighbors that he said we always thought they were anti-Semitic. They saw him. They gave him bread. Now, you and I may think, okay, they gave him bread. If that family was found out, the Nazis would have murdered the entire family. Because that was the punishment for helping Jews, giving them a loaf of bread, having them stay in your house overnight. The punishment under German occupation was death for the entire family. The last stage, the fourth stage, in the destruction of Polish Jewry, according to Raoul Hilberg, is deportation. Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto begins in July 1942. Remember we talked about Adam Chernyakov committing suicide rather than collaborating with the Nazis in the deportation of Warsaw's Jews. In a period of only a few months, 300,000 Jews are deported. The vast majority to Treblinka. The vast majority, as when we visit Treblinka we'll see, were murdered within hours of their arrival. So, tell me what you see. Defiance. What else? Strength. What's above
Screaming
the mother?
for help. Fire.
Fire.
Screaming.
Screaming.
Clothing, clothing in tatters.
Clothing in tatters.
Determination.
Determination, right?
Good.
Look at the eyes.
Central
Yeah,
figure.
looking hopeful,
Look at the
looking
eye.
up.
Someone pointed out to me, only in this past year when I was here, someone pointed out something I didn't notice, and that is, on the one hand, they're very muscular. They look like they've been working out, right? Like they had a gym membership in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Not the starving for money.
Except,
The ribs.
exactly, you could see also the ribs. In other words, he wanted to show them as heroic, but he also wanted to show them as starving, right? Their faces are gaunt, perhaps.
What about the guy on the bottom?
The guy on the bottom,
That's the fallen.
No,
He's-
he's dead.
yes, he's already fallen. Everybody else has a weapon, whether it's a rock or a hand grenade or a gun or a knife. Everybody else, aside from the mother, has a weapon. So what do you see here?
These are the ones who were defeated.
These are the ones who are defeated. Go ahead, keep going. What else do you see?
On the way to their death.
Suffering.
Suffering, good.
But they're holding a Torah, I'm sure, yeah.
Yes, a couple of people already pointed out. This is a clear takeoff on the Arch of Titus. The bas-relief in the Arch of Titus that shows the Jews, the Hebrew slaves being taken from Jerusalem together with the menorah and the chatzotrot, the Klei Mikdash from the temple in Jerusalem. Instead of the Klei Mikdash, instead of the temple vessels, what do we have here? The Sefer Torah. Good. And instead of the Roman spears and swords, what do we have?
We have a Nazi helmet
The,
and
the Nazi
sword.
helmet and the bayonets,
Right.
right, of the Nazis. It meant clearly evoke the Arch of Titus. And why would Natan Rappaport want to evoke the Arch of Titus for the Shoah? Jews understood in those years that this was a third Korban, a third destruction. The first temple was destroyed, the second temple was destroyed, and now European Jewry is destroyed. That's how they perceived it. And so for him, there's a direct link here.
Destruction of the temple.
Take a look at remember we talked about where everybody is facing on the other one? Where are most people facing here?
Looking down.
Do you remember Les Mis, look down?
Look down, wow.
Right?
Yeah. Except for the figure with the Torah.
There are a couple of differences. One, the man holding the Torah is looking up. And his arm is out, and what do you imagine he's doing? He is praying, he is saying, Keli, Keli, Lama Zaftani. He is praying for Yeshua. Okay, good. There are two other figures that are not looking down. The child, who is the child looking at?
Us.
The child is looking either at the bystanders, because this is called their final journey, as they're being led away to the Umschlagplatz that we're going to see soon, or he's looking at us. He's the one who actually draws us into this work of art. And then there's the woman at the very end. What does it mean that she's looking back? Maybe regret.
Longing for
Looking at
Maybe
past
longing-
life,
The end of her life.
Looking back at the past.
lost Polish Jewry.
Looking back, I know when I see her, I think of Eshet Lot, Lot's wife. Looking back at the destruction, or looking back at what once was. It was hard to relate to these people. It was easier to relate to the Mordechai and Leviches and those who fought in the ghetto and the partisans. There was a feeling almost of shame about this side of the Shoah.
The Gaulish Jew.
The idea of Jews going like sheep to the slaughter. There was a feeling of shame. And by the way, that feeling even existed during the Shoah amongst the resistance fighters. In the 1970s in Israel, we have the beginning of what's called L'kol ish yesh shem. Everyone has a name. And people started to relate, both in Israel and in the United States and elsewhere, to these people, to other kinds of heroism. The heroism of a mother who stays with a child. There were different kinds of heroism in the Shoah. Certainly, there were military heroes. But there were heroes of the spirit. There was the Piaseczna Rebbe, the Yesh Kodesh, who every Shabbat gave a drasha trying to raise the morale of the Jews who were coming to shul. And every Motzei Shabbat would write down what it was he said in the drasha to keep it for posterity. There was the heroism of the smugglers. There was the heroism of those people who put on theater productions in the ghettos. There were many kinds of heroism, not only one kind. The heroism of a person who gave up their piece of bread so that their child could eat, or that their elderly parent could eat. That's something I think we have a better understanding of than people did in the late 40s and in the 50s. Emanuel Ringelblum was born in 1900 in the town of Buchach in Galicia, the same town where Shai Agnon was born. It's a shtetl. He grew up in a religious Zionist family, but as many of his generation, he leaves religious observance. He becomes a socialist Zionist, and those remain his passions for his life, together with the study of history. When the war begins, September 1st, 1939, Ringelblum realizes these are very important times that he's living through, and so he begins to keep a diary. But Ringelblum does much more than that, because there were many diarists in the ghetto. Ringelblum organizes a group of about 60 men and women into a group called Einig Shabbos, the Oneg Shabbat group. And they have as their mission to collect every piece of evidence about ghetto life that they can. When the great deportations begin in the summer of 1942, Einig Shabbos realize that their documents need to be hidden because they may be deported at any moment. And so they put the documents, tens of thousands of documents, in tin boxes and most famously in metal milk cans. And they bury them in the hope that they will be discovered after the war. Because the question of who will write our history was their burning question. They did not want the Nazis to write what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. They wanted the Jews to be able to speak for themselves. The BBC learns about the mass massacres of Polish Jews through the Einik Shabbos group. The Einik Shabbos group was sure that once it was broadcast on the BBC and once the German population would hear about the mass massacres, that certainly they would stop. In this they were wrong. The great deportations that begin right around Tisha B'Av, July 1942, and end right before Yom Kippur, September 1942. In about 2 months, 3/4 of the ghetto was deported. 300,000 Jews. And while initially there was a great disbelief that the Jews were being murdered in death camps, there are more and more rumors, more and more evidence as time goes on that the death camps really exist and the Jews are being murdered. The underground sends a courier to follow the trains. And he reaches a certain junction near Treblinka, and he's told, yes, the trains go full, they return empty, there are no food supplies that are being sent after them. More and more of the Jews in the ghetto realize that these Jews have been sent to their death, and there's a great feeling of regret amongst many in the ghetto. How did we allow this to happen? And amongst the younger people, and how did we allow it to happen without a fight? The underground in the Warsaw ghetto in 1942, July 1942, the number of weapons they had totaled 1 pistol. How are they going to fight the German army? The German army had conquered all of Europe. They don't have weapons. Most of them have no military training whatsoever. We know the Nazi reprisals were draconian. There had not been a major revolt in a city occupied by the Germans up until this point. Mordechai Anilevich, and there's a monument right outside there to commemorate him, 23 years old, is the commander of the Jewish forces. And he has resolved that we're not going to escape the ghetto. We're going to fight in the middle of the city because we want the whole world to see. We want the whole world to know about this revolt. So obtaining weapons was very difficult, and in truth, the weapons they had were almost ridiculous. They stood no chance of defeating the German army. So why did they rebel? If they knew they were going to lose, we're not going to go like sheep to the slaughter. This is what Abba Kovna's flyer in the Vilna ghetto says. We're not going to go like sheep to the slaughter. It's an issue of pride. And connected to that, Tamut nafshi im plishtim, as Shimshon said. If I am going to die, then I'm going to take some of them with me. And, you know, this only happens when people realize that they're going to die. Beforehand, the Judenrat and the older leaders in the ghetto are saying, Ibeleben, we'll outlive them, we'll find a way, we have throughout our history, we'll bribe this one, we'll somehow get through. Not knowing about the final solution. The final solution was what Walter Laqueur called the terrible secret. The Nazis tried to keep it secret as long as they could, because they knew that if the Jews know about the final solution, they'll be much more likely to rebel and to resist. So once the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto become convinced that all of those deportations were not merely resettling in the East, but were leading Jews to their death, they understand. But there was another factor too, connected to Tamut nafshi im plishtim. If I'm going to die, let some of the Philistines die with me. And that is the issue of revenge, nakama. Nakama, revenge. In that flyer that Abba Kovno put together, he writes, avenge our brothers and sisters, avenge our parents, avenge our children. Tzivia Lubetkin was one of the ghetto fighters who survived. Tzivia Lubetkin wrote about her experience as a fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto. And she writes that when the German forces came in on April 19th, 1943, and she says, and we started to shoot at them and throw homemade Molotov cocktails on them. And we killed some of them and wounded some of them, and then the Germans retreated. She writes how gratifying it was to see German blood on the streets of Warsaw after seeing so much Jewish blood on the streets of Warsaw. The revolt begins on April 19th. The Germans retreat, but they come back the next day. And they come back the next day not only with reinforcements and artillery, but they also come back with a new strategy. And the strategy is to burn down every house in the ghetto. They come with flamethrowers. The Germans will use the same strategy in August 1944 during the Polish revolt in Warsaw. And the Polish revolt in Warsaw is inspired in part by the Jewish revolt that took place a year before. The biggest battle takes place here at Mila 18, the headquarters of the Jewish Fighting Organization. And this is where Mordechai Nilevich commits suicide rather than be taken captive by the Germans. And it becomes a symbol of the revolt. The Warsaw Ghetto Revolt lasts more than a month. They held out longer than France did. And at the end of the revolt, as we mentioned, General Stroop destroys the great Synagogue of Warsaw and sends a message to Berlin, quote, "The Jewish residential quarter of Warsaw is no more," end quote. Those who fought in the uprising succeeded in inspiring other revolts. It was after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising that there are uprisings in other places. We'll talk about Treblinka and Sobibor, where there are uprisings after this. As I said earlier, it made headlines all over the world, not only in the Jewish press. But it was the first major revolt against the Nazis in a city anywhere in Europe, in Nazi-occupied Europe. For the most part, there is hardly any resistance to the Nazis, not because people sympathize with the Nazis, but because they are so draconian in their reprisals. They are so ruthless and brutal as occupiers that people are afraid to lift their heads against them.